Hey everybody, welcome back to yet another fun and exciting Algebra 1 class. Today we are going to kind of shift gears just a little bit from what we've been talking about with clearing fractions and clearing decimals. And today we're actually going to talk about a different kind of an equation. This equation is called the absolute value equation. Absolute value. It's on page number 65. If you go ahead and look in your book, it's there on page 65. It's 2.6. Lesson number is 2.6. And let's first of all talk about what does it mean when it says absolute value. Well, a couple lessons ago, we actually talked about what the idea of absolute value means, and that was the distance away from zero. And so we talked about that you could have negative values inside the absolute value, and that would just equal their positive value. So if I had negative 6 in an absolute value, then the answer would be 6. And so before we kind of start into the equations, we have to remember that concept there of absolute value. So what's going to happen when we plug this into an equation? Well, here's what's going to happen. You're going to have a positive value, and you're going to have a potential negative value. In other words, because it could be a negative or a positive inside the absolute value, you're going to have to work two separate equations, one with positive values, one with negative values. And you'll see what that means in just a second, but that's kind of the concept, if you will, and that's explained on page number 65 and then a little bit on page number 66. So let's go ahead and look at the bottom of page 66, and I'm going to write these down here on the board, and so you can copy these down in your notebook. They are also in your book. And when I tell you to copy in your notebook, that is because I want you to actually physically write things down. You say, well, but it's in my textbook. I know it's in your textbook. I mean, I get that. But you're writing it on the screen. I'm looking at it. I know. But then when you get to your test, you're going to forget everything because you never wrote it down. So if you will go ahead, take what you're seeing, write it down using your hand, your brain will be able to remember that just a little bit better. And hopefully on your test, you will be able to remember these steps. So let's look down here at the screen where I have the steps for solving absolute value equations written down. Now, here's what we want to do. We want to, first of all, what's called isolate the absolute value. Isolate. What does it mean to isolate? Well, it means to set it aside. It means to get it by itself. Okay, so the idea here is, and we'll do one of these in just a second, so don't worry if you don't totally understand. If there's anything next to the absolute value, let's say there's a 3 next to the absolute value on the outside of the absolute value, you have to get rid of the 3. If there's a plus 2 on the outside of the absolute value, you have to get rid of the plus 2. In other words, all we want on one side of the equation, the only thing that should be on one side of the equation is the absolute value. Everything else goes to the other side of the equation, the other side of the equal sign. Okay. The second thing that we see here is we want to form two separate equations. One with the positive value and one with the negative value. Just like I said, in an absolute value, the x could potentially be a positive or a negative. And so we have to solve the equation with both of those possibilities. We're going to solve them separately. So you're going to solve the positive one separately. You're going to solve the negative one separately. And then the fourth one would be to check your answers. Plural. Interesting right there. Look at that. Plural. You're going to get two answers on these. One for the positive side and one for the negative side. And they should both check. You should be able to get answers for both of them. Now, there is actually kind of one little thing to mention right there. We'll talk about this more a little bit later on. But sometimes when you're doing these, one of them will check and the other one won't check. Sometimes you can get no solution on these. Nothing works for these absolute value ones. So again, we'll talk about that just a little bit more later. But let's worry about the steps right now. Okay. All right, well, let me write down a problem here. We're going to write down in absolute value x plus 3 equals 5. Well, one thing that you would notice right off when you try to do step number 1, isolate the absolute value, you will see that this absolute value is already isolated. There's nothing outside of the absolute value on its side of the equation. So all that we see on the left side of the equation is the absolute value. That's it. Okay? And so that's good. That's where we want to be. That is step number 1. So we're done with step number 1. That was easy. Step number 2, form 2 separate equations, one with the positive value and one with the negative value. So let's come over here, and what we want to do right now is we want to break this down into 2 separate equations. So this would be the positive value, x plus 3 equals 5. In other words, we don't change anything. We just take the positive value of this. Now, with the negative value, let's be careful here because there's a little trick to this. You have to distribute the negative sign. In other words, it's like saying the negative sign is out front and you have to distribute it in. You can't just make it a negative x. Don't just make it a negative x because you will get it wrong, I promise you. You have to distribute it. And so let's go ahead and work that negative side right now because our next step is solve them separately. Okay, so we're going to solve them separately. So let's solve this one. Let's just go down this. And we want to distribute. That is the first thing that we do. We get negative x minus 3 equals 5. Negative x minus 3 equals 5. Now, I want to take the numbers to the one side and the letters to the other side. So we're going to have a plus 3 and a plus 3. Why? Because we want to get rid of that 3 here. So that leaves us negative x equals 8. And now there's a little trick right here because we don't want it to be negative x over here. We want it to be positive x, or we just want it to be x. Okay? So we have to divide both sides by negative 1. Don't forget there's always a 1 in front of that. That's a lot of students forget that. So that's going to cancel, and we're going to get x equals negative 8. That would be one of our answers. Okay? Now we would come over here to the other side, and now we have to work the positive side. This one's a little bit easier because we don't have the negative to worry with. So minus 3, that's going to cancel. And we're going to get x equals 2. I got 2 different answers. I got x equals 2 and x equals negative 8. Now I want to show you something. What happens now is we are going to test these or try these out. So absolute value x plus 3 equals x plus 3 and absolute value equals 5. So let's try these. Let's try the 2 first from up here. So basically we want to take that 2 and put it right there. See what happens. 2 plus 3 equals 5. 5 equals 5. Bingo, we got it. That's good. So the 2 checks. And so 2 is part of our answer. That one checks. Now let's try this one. Let's try this negative 8. Some of you are thinking right now, Mr. Steve, there is no way that if 2 works, that negative 8 is going to work. It's just not possible. Okay, I know enough about equations to know this is not possible. Well, let's see what happens. Let's take a little look here. So we put that here, and we have absolute value negative 8 plus 3, absolute value equals 5. Well, when we do this, when we solve this in here, we get negative 5 in absolute value equals 5. Remember what we said when we taught the section on absolute value. What is the absolute value of negative 5? It's 5. 5 equals 5. That is also a solution, so both of these work. X equals negative 8 works, and x equals 2 also works. Okay? Pretty neat, huh? So some of you thought that that wasn't possible, but we just proved that theory was false. It is possible. Let's see here. Let me try another one that's a little bit different. I want to give you one that we have to actually simplify, or we actually have to do step number 1. And so here's one. 2 absolute value x plus 1 minus 3 equals 7. And if you're looking on your book, it's on page number 68 that I jumped to. So page 68. All right, so now what I want to do is I want to remember what I said, we have to isolate. I want you to see a couple things. Look at this right here. There's a 2 outside of the absolute value. And then I want you to see this right here. There's a -3 outside of the absolute value. So we just want this on a side by itself. We have to isolate. That's step number 1. If we go back over here, isolate the absolute value. So what I want to do here is I want to add 3 to both sides because we're going to start with the addition property. That's how we solve equations. Well, that's going to cancel, so we're going to get 2 absolute value x plus 1. That cancel equals 7 plus 3 is 10. Well, we're still not done with step number 1. We still have to isolate this. That 2 is still out there. Okay? Now, if there's no sign in here, what is happening with that 2? Okay, good. It's being multiplied. So what we want to do is we want to divide by 2. That's going to cancel that. If we do it to one side, we have to do it to the other side. So we're going to get x plus 1 in absolute value equals 5. Now this is finally where we finally got it isolated. So we can come over here to step number 2. Form 2 separate equations, one with the positive, one with the negative. So let's come back here, and now we can form our 2 equations, one with the positive, one with the negative. So we'll have absolute value of x. Well, we don't need absolute value, so we're getting rid of that. So just the positive and then the negative. Don't forget, we have to distribute that negative sign. That is the number 1 thing that kids miss right there. So don't forget to distribute our negative sign. All right, so let's just go ahead and solve this. -1 minus 1. And then that's going to cancel. We're going to get x equals 4. That is one of our answers right there. And then our other answer, we would come over here and we would distribute our negative sign. So we get -x minus 1 equals 5. Add 1 to each side, and we're going to get -x equals 6. Don't forget how to do this. We have to divide each side by -1. That's going to cancel. We're going to get x equals -6. X equals -6. And those are our 2 answers. I'm not going to take the time in this video, but if you went back and plugged those back in to the original equation right here, then you would see that we end up with them checking. Okay. So if you go ahead and try that, follow the steps, stick with the steps piece by piece, make sure that you first, let me scroll back up to the steps, that you first isolate the absolute value, get it by itself. If you try to do this without isolating, you're going to get them wrong, promise. Number 2, separate them, one positive, one negative. Don't forget to distribute the negative. Write that down in your notebook. Distribute negative. Number 3, solve them separately. And then number 4, check both of your answers. Okay? All right, we'll see you later. Have a good one. Bye-bye.